Welcome everyone for the last class in this course. This is the 12th presentation and it will cover two themes, sex and death. Eroticism in ceramics is a very interesting characteristic of ceramic material, ceramic processes, and ceramic objects. And this is the material we will be looking at today in this presentation. We have seen prehistoric idols before. They are the earliest ceramic objects ever found, and they are eroticized female figures from around 26,000 years ago all the way to today, really. Two examples here, two views of one example from Neolithic Cyprus with female and male attributes in a very abstracted manner, and contemporary example by Hungarian artist Georgi Fuss with a Gaia on the left and a Priapus on the right. So the urge to express erotic feelings and emotions and relationships in ceramic goes back a long time, and it's still very vibrant in contemporary culture. A mold from Mesopotamia on the right and its impression on the left. So there are all kinds of erotic representation in ceramics in the world, and we will be looking at quite a few of them. There is an erotic brick from Han Dynasty China here. Sorry for the poor quality of the image, but you deal with what you can find online sometimes. This is an example from India from the 2nd century BCE. Some example from Egypt and from Roman time here. So it is interesting to consider that such representations are found all over the world, everywhere. We've looked at Greek Attic pottery before in a variety of contexts. You are made aware that those aesthetics and those themes are not separate and independent from one another, but they conflate together and they are related in so many ways, and it's cumulatively that they become quite interesting to consider. So in the reading I assigned for today, I discussed this beautiful image by Sosias from 500 BCE of Achilles and Patroclus. An example by Duris here of satyrs dancing and playing with vessel objects and sporting erections. Various scenes of cleaning and seductions are found on those types of ware, and here are two very beautiful examples. Seduction scenes are quite interesting, and they can be recognized by the fact that the older man is often offering a rooster to the younger man, and the rooster serves as a gift for the giving and receiving of sexual favors. This is an Ganymede figure on the right, a very important myth of Greek religion, where Zeus abducted a young boy and basically raped him. More seduction scenes. Seduction scenes in Greek art are always between males, because the relationship between male and females was of a very different nature, unless it was between prostitutes, which were basically slaves, and males. Other examples here of seduction scenes, they're quite common, and you find them in a variety of ways, and they're quite an interesting aspect of Greek culture to consider, and this is again discussed in the reading. So man-boy love was something characteristic of Greek culture. And on those two images, note that the genitals are clearly represented despite their unusual position. So it is not arbitrary that the genitals are given visibility. This is an example by Onesimus of a cleansing scene where on the vessel, on the floor of the representation, it says kalos. And kalos means beautiful, and it is a common descriptive used when young men are represented. Here is a seduction scene from Corinth from 1600 of the Common Era. Examples of prostitution here where slavery was at the center of that trade in Greece. Another image of a prostitution scene. And contemporary artist Joyce Kozloff, working in 1987, combining both the Asian aesthetics and the classical aesthetics with representation of eroticism from Asian art and Greek art as well. So it's a very interesting conflation of different cultures coming together in this beautiful drawing. We also find sexualized objects, objects with sexual attributes, like this sexualized cup on the left from Greece and this breast vase from Minoan time on the right. Another example of this amazing cup with a sexual foot. Quite an interesting object in quite a variety of ways. Of course, phalluses and penises and male sexual organs are very commonly found on those types of wares, and their nature is not necessarily sexual. They are a sign of good luck, basically, and in that sense they brought good luck by being represented in such a way. So not everything sexual is necessarily erotic, and not everything erotic is necessarily sexual, and sometimes sexuality is meant symbolically to represent something else, like good luck, good fortune, and so on. So again, the representations of penises with wings. And a rhyton is a type of drinking vessel, and Roman lamps very often contain very exaggerated sexual attributes. They may have been used in brothels, for example. This is quite an extraordinary stamnos from the red figure style in Greece, with those reconstructed from fragments, huge phalluses around the superior aspect of the object. This little vessel by Nearchos is discussed in the reading as well. It shows all kinds of sexual scenes. It's a very small object. It's probably less than 10 centimeter high, and very miniature descriptions on it. This is a puppet, an articulated puppet with sexual attributes. So sometimes those objects are quite humorous. They may be used as toys in a variety of contexts and so on. But there is a very interesting relationship between humor and making fun of bodies and sexuality. This is a scene of a Roman brothel. Roman lamps as well, with penises, phalluses, and sexual scenes. They're very common. There are large numbers of them found in archaeological digs. Another example of a Roman lamp with phalluses. So phalluses and breasts are very common, and I'm just showing you so many of them because they're quite interesting in their number and their prevalence, and how they were so embedded in the culture of Roman people and found in all kinds of form, in all kinds of ways. Again, example of drinking cups called rhytons. This is a very interesting object. It's a perfume bottle, and it was attached with a string through provided holes. It was worn around the waist, strategically positioned. And two more examples of those aidoion. Here, aidoion is the Greek term for a representation of sexual organs, male and female. So it's quite interesting that those objects were made, and they were actually functional objects meant to be worn in public, and they were quite popular. Large numbers of them have been found. And other selections of phalluses from England, from different times, different periods, and so on, all of which are drinking cups of various types. And Ted Newton in the contemporary world making similar objects, and he calls those self-portraits. An example from Ukraine from 4000 BCE. So this is an object that's 6,000 years old, and it was probably used as a pipe. Votive wombs are also quite common, placed as offering in sanctuaries to obtain cure for various sicknesses. Most body parts and internal organs are found represented, and here we have two wombs. A lot of examples from pre-Columbian America as well. I really like those two little guys from Peru. And the moche culture of Peru is a very important erotic culture in the world, especially in its connection to ceramic. And again, this is discussed in the reading for this week. The figure on the left is articulated. You can move the head back and forth. And on the right, we have Eros and Thanatos, sex and death combined together. And this is basically the subject of the talk today, where after this presentation on sex, we will have a presentation on death and the relationship between the two. And this relationship between Eros and Thanatos is particularly found quite intimately in moche erotic ceramics. And the joining of sexuality with death is common in most world cultures, but it's very often found in moche ware from Peru. Here are two contemporary examples by John DeFazio and Mark Burns. So this great power of combining sex and death is something that has been investigated by many artists and are still quite potent to investigate today. So in moche ceramic with an erotic content, heterosexual anal intercourse is the most common sexual representation we find. And this is an interesting phenomenon in itself. And again, it's discussed in the reading further. I'm just showing you some examples of that. And in the moche culture of Peru, reversal rituals, which is what is described here with the above ground world of the living on top and the below ground world of the dead below. And at a certain time of the year, it was speculated that the dead would come back to the living world, and in order to push them back into the underworld, reversal ritual had to take place, and heterosexual anal intercourse was one of those reversal ritual. And I find this explanation quite convincing and quite interesting. So when we look at those objects, you can't read them literally. They are profoundly symbolic, ritual, and religious objects. They were made as offering in tombs, and they carry all kinds of very important symbolic meaning for those cultures. And here we have the gods create the world. On the object itself, a drawing of the image and an unwrapped photograph above as well. So from those three different visions of these objects, we can understand better the scene represented. So sometimes there are funny aspects to this as well. On the left, an anthropomorphized penis holding its nose inside a vagina, and on right, a figure of fellatio. So basically all sexual activities are represented on moche ceramics. Here you have example of cunnilingus, examples of clitoral stimulation, some bird scenes as well, which are quite interesting in themselves. And of course, animals also engaging in sexual activities. And again, it's for the symbolic nature of those representations that such objects were made. We have a jaguar copulating with a human on the left and a sexualized deer on the right, an image I've shown you in a variety of contexts before. Again, copulating couples from the Nazca culture on the left, and on the right, this is a representation of Pachamama, the Inca goddess of the earth. Some objects are also sexualized in a very interesting way. Here you have a Nazca menstruating bowl and a vagina vase on the right. And you have all kinds of ritual vessels where the content of the vessel would be brought to the mouth of the person using the objects through the vaginal opening or the penile opening of the object itself. And notice the very prominent clitoris on those representations as well. The moche culture was the first cultures to represent vaginal sexual organs anatomically, with the presence of the clitoris being quite prominent. And we have examples of that here on the left with this libation vessel and a scene of sodomy on the right. Again, a very wonderful object here where the vessel is penetrating the figure, and there is intimacy between the figure and the vessel in ways, in a graphic way that's quite maybe shocking, but very powerful anyway. Again, Peruvian moche culture, sexual ceramics on the left with the vaginal representation, and on the right a penis representation. Other examples of phalluses with painted surfaces by the Paracas culture of Peru. All the cultures of Peru, there are many of them over this large country, have done erotic ceramics. And it's quite interesting that over a period of a few thousand years, all the way to today, the cultures of Peru are particularly interested in the relationship between sexuality and ceramics. Venereal disease are often represented as well, and vessels in the shape of various sexual organs, like we see on the right. Those are photographs I took at Museo Cassinelli in Trujillo, Peru. And again, the figure on the left is articulated. It can move back and forth in the penetration activity. Example from the Taino culture of Haiti on the left, and from Congo in Africa on the right. From Togo, both female and male ritual vessels. So again, this is found all over the world in most cultures, and these connections between ceramic and sexuality and human bodies and various pottery forms are interesting to consider and are analyzed in the reading for this course. Female genital coverings from Brazil, and a beautiful sexualized vase from the Etruscan culture of Italy. Some example from the Anasazi, Pueblo, Mimbres cultures of Southwest United States, with a penetration scene on the left and a couple in bed on the right. Contemporary example by the sculptor and painter Juan Miró, and again, very stylized, very abstracted, but clearly sexual representations. Breast vases are quite common in many cultures. Those are two examples from China, from Neolithic times. And breasts are not as common as phalluses, but they are reasonably common as well, and those are two examples of that. An example from Moche, Peru again. And an example by Pablo Picasso on the left, and the wonderful breast bowl for the drinking of milk by Jean-Jacques Lagrenet, made at Sèvres in 1766. And of course, again, we revisit the Bourdaloue from France in the 18th century that I discussed in the hygiene chapter. Example in Italian maiolica from De Ruta. And we've seen the example on the left before. All who see me think I have a dickhead, read in reversed lettering on the left, and on the right, this lady at the market says, "Women, come have some good fruits," with penises for offer in the basket. Sorry for the poor quality of the image. Example of various myths painted on maiolica plates by the Fontana Workshop in Urbino. Two donkeys copulating from the collection of the Gardner Museum in Toronto, and an anonymous wet drug jar, again with a winged phallus with a bell around its neck, which is a sign of good luck as well, and fortune, and good things happening to you. An example from Castelli of a woman breastfeeding an older man, and this woman lifting her skirt to reveal her genitalia on the right from Faenza. Many examples coming from China and Asian cultures as well. This very early Neolithic Bampo bowl from China with dancing men holding hands with large genitals. Other example here from China and from France. Thousands of those representations are found in other art forms as well, like printmaking and painting and sculpture and so on, but they're quite prevalent in ceramics because ceramics is a domestic art form. It's meant for the daily use and needs of people. It's found in homes and so on, and sometimes they hide sexual scenes, like this example from the Kangxi period of China. So there is a very intimate relationship between those type of objects, what they were made for, where they were found, and the kind of scenes that can be found of them as well, quite often of an erotic nature. Those examples from Japan, again with the image underneath the plate so that it's a pleasant surprise when you flip the object and see what's underneath, or when you are drinking and eating from it and all of a sudden your guest sees what's hidden underneath. Those air curlers from France from the 19th century, they'd be filled with hot water and then used to modify hairstyles. This is a game that was invented in France in the 18th century. It's called the Jeu de l'Hymen, or the game of erotic love, and you went through the labyrinth and all kinds of sexual activities would happen, and you'd be told to kiss your partner or touch them in a certain way and discover bodies and erotic pleasure through playing this game with somebody else. Some erotic tiles are also reasonably common. This is a fireplace plaque from England from the 17th century. A beautiful low high relief model by Tobias Sergel from the 18th century as well. Small erotic figures from Russia. An erotic figurine from France where you can lift her skirt and reveal her bum with a little bug on it. Erotic figures from Denmark from the 1930s. Those eroticized sailors and anonymous figurines from the Lomonosov factory in Russia. This is a very interesting teapot made at Worcester in 1881 called the Oscar Wilde teapot. It's designed by James Hadley. One side of the teapot is male, the other side is female, and underneath there is an inscription that reads, "Fearful consequences through the laws of natural selection and evolution of living up to one's teapot," which is basically making fun of the famous writer Oscar Wilde, who got in trouble with the law quite soon after that teapot was designed. Other example of brotherly love in a ceramic context, the one on the right, those two older gentlemen made at Capodimonte in Italy. Male courtship, again at Deruta in the 16th century. So it's interesting to consider all those variety of objects and the different places they were made and the different representations that they hold and what meaning they may convey. And it's quite interesting that sometimes there is religious commentary or political relationship being developed in those type of things. And little perfume bottles with copulating roosters and hens. You find miniatures of that in Mexico as well, still today. And sometimes when you lift the little turkey, there is an erotic scene inside. Those objects are extremely small, about the size of a toonie. George Orr designing New Orleans brothel tokens with rude word games. George Orr, who makes its presence felt in most of those aesthetics and themes, made a lot of eroticized work, like this vagina bank on the left or this menstrual vase on the right. And the very last image for the sex presentation is by Merit Oppenheim, her very famous Breakfast in Furs from the Surrealist period, combining very mundane domestic objects with a material that engages us with erotic thoughts and feelings and so on. So we will continue the presentations today with the death theme, which completes all presentations for this class. Continuing with the presentation on sex, this is the last presentation for this course, and it is on death, the fragmentation of time, the past, the present, and the future. So again, this intimate relationship between Eros and Thanatos, between sexuality and death, is exemplified in those two objects, one by Ken Price, the other by Johan Cretten from Belgium. And this is the continuation of this investigation of eroticism, another aspect of human nature in the use of death in the ceramic context. Those are from Jericho in very ancient times, thousands of years old. They're plastered skull portraits. They're actual skulls covered in plaster with shells. And it's a very interesting relationship between ceramics and death going back in time very far. So of course we find all kinds of burial objects made for the specific needs of funerary purposes, like this burial urn from the Neolithic with wonderful designs, and this double cinerary urn from Crete. Cinerary urn are specifically for the holding of ashes of cremated body. Those are sarcophagus from Israel, and they're basically life-size, and the lid could be removed so that the deceased could be put inside and then they'd be buried. Details of such sarcophagus as they were found, broken and damaged, and then rebuilt by restorers and archaeologists for museum displays later on, but this is how it would have been found in the ground on the right. All kinds of burial pots from every culture in the world, really, because funerary rites and rituals are very important in all cultures of the world. On the right, a Neolithic cemetery from Japan. Those are burial urns from Neolithic Crete to contain cremated remains again. So the bodies would be cremated, and then the bones and ashes from that process would be put into those smaller urns and then placed in temples or in altars in homes or buried in the ground. There are various uses for them. Those are Minoan coffins from Crete. Again, they're not life-size coffins. They're not meant to contain the whole body, but the bones and ashes of cremated remains. This is an example of a burial chamber in Turkey. So the chamber is lined by a very large pot, and the body is contained inside with various offerings in ceramics and other material placed within it. Mesopotamian burials are often taking place inside two very large pots. So two pots would be used to close a volume in which the body would then be inserted. We find all kinds of examples of representations of funerary ritual as well in many cultures. This one on the left is from the Nayarit culture of Mexico, and on the right a Bronze Age cinerary urn. In Attic Greek pottery, if the ground of the vessel is white, it means that it is a funerary object, because white is the color of death in Greek Attic pottery. And very often those objects were made specifically for funerary purposes, for offering in tombs, and they very often depict scenes of funerary rites as well, and images of the afterlife. And they give us a tremendous amount of information on how the Greek proceeded with their rituals around death and their use of cemeteries and so on and so forth. This is an example here of miniature vessel inside a large container. Very often, as in most cultures, funerary offerings are not true size. They are miniatures made specifically for the needs of offerings in tomb and the life of the deceased in the afterworld. And on the right, on this lichitoi form, we have discarded broken offerings of pots on the ground. And on the left, a reworking of a lichitoi form by Montreal artist Richard Millet. And on the right, a very interesting X-ray photograph of one of those vases, which shows the false interior space for cheating on the offering. Liquitoi are meant to contain perfume, and perfume were very expensive, so they would make fake interior space liquitoi with a much smaller amount of material contained to pretend they were making a large offering to the deceased for those witnessing the event, but in actuality there was very little perfume contained into those types of objects, and this is an X-ray of one of those things. Archaic Greek funerary vessels from very ancient times in Greek cultures with details of mourners and corpse and people crying and funerary processions and so on and so forth. One find representations of funerary rites on vessels from all over the world in throughout time. And on the right, this Etruscan funerary scene from the 6th century BCE. Often plaques were deposited in cemeteries as well, showing funerary rites, funerary events, and this is such an example of a plaque from 520 BCE as well. Scenes of mourning are quite common. This is an example here on the bell amphora by the painter of the Vatican mourner, and it's Eos mourns Menon that is represented. This is a scene of a human sacrifice where the figure is going to be placed on the fire and burned. This is an example of funerary procession from Archaic Greek, 700 BCE. Again, an object probably not made as a toy, but as an offering in tombs for the dead. This very wonderful Etruscan sarcophagus. The husband and wife would be placed together in such a coffin after their respective death. So the coffin could be reopened, and once the second person died, they would be placed together in such a coffin. It's life-size. It's quite a wonderful object, the most beautiful Etruscan sarcophagus we have, and it's quite an amazing object to contemplate in a variety of ways. Canopy jars are found in Egypt, but also in Etruscan cultures. They were meant to contain ashes from cremation for the Etruscans, and for the Egyptians they were meant to contain the internal organs of the deceased. The internal organs would be removed from bodies in the process of embalming and mummification, and those internal organs would be placed into those canopy jars, which would be deposited into the tomb with the sarcophagus containing the mummy. A beautiful burial urn from Colombia in South America, and another beautiful example from Mesoamerica here, from around that time too. Wonderful representations of death in Olmec cultures of Mexico, and from Aztec time, this wonderful skull jar. Example from the Chansey culture of Peru on the left, and again this wonderful moche ritual vessel combining sexuality and death, again from the moche culture of Peru. Scenes again from the extraordinarily beautiful and intricate and complex moche ceramics, a sacrifice on the left with this figure being tortured by a bird, and on the right the decapitator god who is removing the head of a sacrificial victim again. We've looked at images of Eros and Thanatos, death and sex before. You have a skeleton family on the left, a tumescent cadaver in the middle, and a skull vessel on the right, all of them from the moche culture again. And this wonderful fine line vessel from the moche culture, the upper and under worlds, the world of the living and the world of the dead, which are very closely connected in moche religious mythologies. An example of a human sacrifice from the Maya culture on the left, and a Maya cremation urn on the right. Mayan burial scene on the left. It's very difficult to read because it's so abstracted and stylized and so on, but this is really what's going on that vessel. And another one of those wonderful urn for funerary purposes by the Mayan culture on the right. I've talked about Sipitotec, the god of rain, and the god of renewal, the god of spring, and the god of corn growing again in fields. It represents a priest wearing the upside down skin of a sacrificial human victim. Other representation of Sipitotec here on this wonderful head on the left and on a tripod from the Mexica culture on the right. All the way to today in Ocumicho in Michoacan, the old village produces those little skull miniature groupings and figurine objects of great charm and quite amazing. Those are burial sort of coffins from a culture in Peru. Again, they were built out of rock clay into the cliffs where the deceased would then be deposited and become part of the community by their presence there. Again, a contemporary artist using images of death and images of sexuality, combining the two together for the potency of the conflation. A funerary ritual vessel from Longshan, China. This is Neolithic Chinese ceramic. It's one of the earliest examples of a throne vessel in the history of ceramic. They're extremely thinly potted, very, very light, extremely beautifully made, and quite interesting in their modernist quality. They could be made now and they would be just as fresh and relevant, and they are thousands of years old. And on the right, a Mimbrais kill bowl, which was placed over the face of the dead in burials. So in order to remove the bowl from the world of the living, a hole would be punctured at its bottom, and then it would be placed on the face of the deceased so that their soul could travel into heaven after death. All kinds of funerary urns are made all over the world. Those are from Song Dynasty, China. Another one from the Jin Dynasty here, they're called spirit jar, and they basically represent an idealized heaven where everything is beautiful and perfect and fun and amazing. And on the right, Han Dynasty funerary offering of an ox and cart. We've talked about Tang horses before and Tang funerary offerings, which are lead-glazed earthenware, which would have been toxic for the living. So it's a good thing they were used specifically for funerary offering in tombs. Pottery figures of women at work, funerary offerings from Western China. An image here of a Jin tomb from China, the 12th century of the Common Era, with the interior of a tomb with polychrome bricks. An example of an ancestor altar from contemporary China, and a Han Dynasty effigy offerings. So those are miniature fruits and vegetables and furniture meant to be placed in tombs, again for the needs of the deceased in the afterlife. Funerary urns from Okinawa, Japan, made for a few centuries in that small island in southern Japan, and they're still made today and still in use in that part of the world. This is a flower wreath in polychrome earthenware. They're made in Paris and they're very common in French cemeteries. They start to be made in the 18th, 19th century, and they're still commonly produced and deposited in cemeteries in France. And again, it's this relationship around the permanency of ceramics and its archival nature, and the fact that those flowers will never fade, they will never rot and disappear. This is the wonderful scarab vase by Adelaide Alsop Robineau, made around 1900. She made the vase, which is her masterpiece, to contain her own ashes, and now the vase and her ashes are in the Everson Museum in Syracuse, New York. It's probably one of the most beautiful vase made for that purpose in the history of ceramics. This is an example of my own work. It's a funerary urn I made for the French philosopher Michel Foucault when he died of AIDS in the early 1980s. Some mausoleums as well are found in many cultures of the world. This is Islamic cultures of Uzbekistan, the Gorimir Mausoleum in Samarkand. This is the tomb of Bibi Jawindi in Pakistan. A Ming tomb altar from Nanjing on the left, and the very beautiful Samadin mausoleum in Bukhara that we have discussed in the shelter chapter. And this is the interior of the Samadin mausoleum with a tomb from Bukhara. This is the Dalton Mausoleum in London, England. The Daltons were a very famous family of ceramic manufacturer, and in a cemetery in London we have their tomb completely made out of ceramic material. This is the tomb of Julian Sturgis from 1904, again a ceramic plaque found in a cemetery in England. American tombstones made out of thrown stoneware. So ceramics is a very common material, it's very cheap, it's very accessible, and it finds its ways in all kinds of contexts, domestic and public, and even in cemeteries and in funerary rites. Of course, if we are considering funerary rituals and purposes, the Qin Terracotta Army has to make its presence felt one more time, as does the Anjindi's tomb in Anyangling in China that we have discussed previously in the figuration chapter. This is an image again of that wonderful tomb near Xi'an in China. This amazing coffin from the Zoroastrian culture in China. The body was air dried, then placed above ground, as the religion of the Zoroastrian forbade burials. Now, a small section on shards, cracks, and broken fragments, because when a pot breaks, it basically dies. It's basically been killed. It's now dead in so many ways. So I want these sections to talk about this death of ceramics through their breakage. And this is the oldest pottery ever found from around 18,000 BCE in China. In Rome, Italy, there is a very large hill called Monte Testaccio, and it is the repository for broken pots, containing the history of commerce for more or less 2,000 years. So in Italy, up to today, when a pot breaks, the shards are brought to that big hill and deposited on top, and we have the whole history of pottery making since Roman times contained in layers after layers of shards and broken pots on that hill in Rome, Italy. In funerary offerings, we often find necklaces made with shards so that even poor people would have interesting jewelry. I've discussed this throwaway lemonade cup in Mexico City before. They would have been thrown to the ground and broken after use, but I kept mine for the purpose of this presentation. Many contemporary artists are using broken shards and broken vessels for the potency of ceramics to speak of fragility, of psychological state, of the passage of times, of the difficulty of maintaining anything stable in human relationships and so on and so forth. And this is funerary ritual vessels in Japan. Again, images from funerary ritual where various vessels are inscribed with designs and text and so on, and then thrown into river and deposited with the dead and so on. A wonderful example of kintsugi repair by Onami Koetsu that have been discussed previously in the material aesthetic chapter. Other example of kintsugi repairs here, just to refresh your memory of that interesting idea to repair something broken or cracked in order to improve its aesthetic quality. A few years ago, a visitor at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, England, fell while coming down the stairs, and he hit those vases and broke them all, those beautiful Chinese famille verte vases, and then they were repaired by the museum restorers, and the image below is of those vases after repair, so they look completely brand new again. The Chinese artist Liu Jianhua makes a lot of slip casts from objects in daily life, and of course in the process of making all of those objects, many of them warp and crack and break, or are destroyed after their making, and he makes large-scale installations of those fragmented things to speak of those issues of permanency versus change and eternity versus the passage of time. I find those human casts made out of the leftover space by decaying bodies in Pompeii to be quite moving and disturbing in many ways. Images of death are also related to war. You have a stink bomb from 17th century English and a Byzantine grenade on the right. Images of skulls are very common in ceramics as well. This is an example from Nymphenburg from 1756. In Aran porcelain in Hungary, this is an object that would have been made for the last 200 years or so and is still being produced today. Another one here on a book in a religious context from Zsolnay in Hungary. And as soon as photography was invented, it found its ways into cemeteries and funerary rites again, and those are early photo prints on tombstone. An interesting use of the figurine broken to reveal a skeleton inside by Marco Polo Rolla, and this very large skull made with bricks by Zhang Wan from China. This wonderful little jar from the Ziwiye culture of Iraq. It's a funerary offering. It's the earliest glazedware in history, and it shows a man being killed by a spear on the right. So again, the relationship between ceramic technology, history, human nature, and death embedded in those wonderful objects. This is a memorial and urn for Sigmund Freud. It actually contains his ashes. It's in his house in London, England, and it's a bell crater red figure from Attic, Greece, from the 5th century BC that he particularly loved and prized, and today it contains the ashes of him and his wife in the house they occupied in London. The crematorium in the Nazi concentration camps would have been unthinkable without ceramic technology and ceramic material. And the very last image for all of those presentations on aesthetics and themes for this class on the history of ceramics, titled The Art of the Future, this wonderful plate of 1661 which tells us, "You and I are Earth." Thank you all.